Welcome to Supercool, the show about low-carbon innovations now scaling. Each week, we talk with the founders, CEOs, and executives building solutions that grow profits, cut carbon, and capture new markets. This is the rise of the low-carbon economy, a multi-trillion-dollar transformation already underway. I'm your host, Josh Dorfman. Stay up to date on new Supercool episodes by subscribing wherever you're listening. And if you're enjoying the show, please take a moment to leave us a review. 505 State Street in downtown Brooklyn is the first all-electric skyscraper in New York City. 44 stories, 440 units, no fossil fuels on site. Instead, it's got electric induction range stoves, electric heat pump systems for heating and cooling, high-performance insulation and triple-glazed windows to slash energy demand, and a hot water system engineered to run on electricity. The building was designed and built by Alloy Development, a developer that knows Brooklyn block by block because it's the only place it builds. The high-rise also anchors Alloy Block, an entire city block aiming to be the most sustainable in the world. 2 new passive house schools to give students healthier air and quieter classrooms. 19th century buildings preserved and adapted for modern retail. And next up, 1 3rd Avenue, the tallest passive house skyscraper in the world. When I asked Jared Della Valle, Alloy's CEO, how he feels about all this, the climate pioneer label, media headlines using words like monumental and world-changing, and Fast Company naming Alloy one of the 50 most innovative companies in the world, he laughed. What's top of mind for him isn't the recognition. It's the hundreds of millions of dollars he and his partners have personally guaranteed to make these projects happen. Jared never set out to be a green builder. He set out to design beautiful buildings. But he realized early that architects don't decide what gets built. Developers do. So he became both, which sounds obvious when you say it out loud, but runs entirely against how the industry works. For Alloy, sustainability started as necessity. In Dumbo, under the Manhattan Bridge, noise and vibration made standard construction unlivable, so they built to passive house standards. And when a political standoff in Albany put new gas hookups in doubt for Brooklyn, that's when Alloy decided to go all electric. From there, the mission sharpened. Beauty, equity, sustainability, affordable and market rate apartments built to the same quality, with the same finishes and the same access. Every decision made on a 100-year view, because as Jared and his partners say, buildings aren't cupcakes. You can't toss a batch if it goes wrong. But Jared is driven by more than practicality, risk management, and creating buildings his climate-aware daughters can be proud of. Profit is also front and center. And Alloy has shown that green building is really good business. Case in point, Goldman Sachs, which told Jared that when it financed 505 State Street, it was the first time the investment bank's credit committee held a serious conversation about sustainability and social equity as part of the approval process. For Alloy's upcoming passive house skyscraper, 14 lenders competed to finance the $500 million project, giving the firm leverage to choose partners and secure strong terms. Ultimately, Alloy isn't just proving that sustainable skyscrapers in city blocks can be built. It's showing that they can deliver consistent returns, attract capital, and even reshape how Wall Street judges risk. That's how the low-carbon future becomes a safe financial bet. Here's my conversation with Jared. Jared, welcome to Supercool.
Thanks so much for having me. Excited to be here.
So to jump in, how would you describe what Alloy is trying to do in Brooklyn right now?
That's a good question. Look, Brooklyn is our focus because it's where we work and live. And I live 150 feet from where I work. And we've been in the same space for 20 years and have been in Dumbo for 25 now. We see a little bit of our role as being the instigator, industry instigator, not just for Brooklyn, but for real estate in general. The beauty of having a fairly young company, and we're 20 years old, is the sort of generational way of doing real estate in New York is changing and technology is changing. And because we're all architects doing development, we feel an obligation to try new stuff and not look at the way it's been done, but to look at the way it could be done today. And with that, we're willing to experiment. We're taking risk, right? The role of the developer fundamentally is to take risk. We acquire sites, we raise capital, we sign guarantees, we make things. And the question is, what kinds of things do we want to make that are going to last 100 years? And, technological obsolescence is so prevalent, but the way that we've been building buildings historically is also not the way we should be building them today. And so because we don't have a portfolio of existing work, our goal is to try things and not to get flustered by the engineers saying, no, that's not how our other clients do it, but to try to learn from the process, do the new research, and attempt to figure out what does good look like today.
Okay, so Alloy is pushing the envelope on sustainability, which is fascinating. We're going to talk about that. What I find equally fascinating is your motivation, as I understand it, when you founded Alloy, wasn't necessarily to say, I am going to be a sustainability pioneer. But in this ethos, which sounds like we are going to figure out what is good, challenge orthodoxy or the way things are done. And it sounded like, from what I understand, some of your awareness that saying like, whoa, I'm an architect, trained as an architect. I may not have as much control over this whole process as I may have thought going into this, seems to influence a lot of how you've evolved
Yeah.
your firm and your firm's point of view.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's funny. And my business partner, AJ, and I had the same thought in two different locations at the same time, which is just sort of funny. You can be in architecture school, you can be the most talented person in the room, but still somebody is going to make the decision, yes, I'm going to invest in that, or I'm going to pay for that. And yes, that's what I want, right? And so you're staring at yourself going, wow, wouldn't it be great if I could be that decision maker? If I could be the architect and the person developing the priorities where we're going to invest and the principles under which we're going to invest and the program, you could really control the outcome. And then you can design where value is and you can figure out where to invest and where you should put the effort and how to prioritize all of the different complexities in an individual project. And so I think we both had that thought in school and we didn't know each other. And after about 10 years of being an architect and trying to figure out how to make work in the city, I had written this paper when I was in graduate school that was about being an architect developer and being like, oh, yeah, I should do that. And then, when I was in my mid 20s and there wasn't an internet and all those things, I hired this old gray hair broker to go approach landowners about buying their buildings. And I didn't have any money and I didn't have any experience. And, I had written this one business plan and I didn't have a network here in New York. I went to school in the Midwest at WashU. And even though I am fundamentally a New Yorker, I grew up on Long Island. I just didn't know how to make work for myself as an architect. So some of it was about value creation. And when I mean that, I mean pure dollar bills. Like, how do I make work as an architect where I get to build buildings, not just whatever somebody felt gracious enough to give me as a commission and make me feel lucky about, but like, how do you actually get to design buildings in New York? And I'm sort of like, yeah, I'm just going to be the developer. And it was so funny at the time because I'd find these properties. If I had an accepted offer, I'd hand the contract to my quote attorney, who was my old roommate from school, and I would go after projects and look for capital. And what's so funny is, of course, nobody ever questioned that I'd be the architect, but nobody questioned that I'd be the developer either. And I never went to school for development. I never went to school for any of this. And it was sort of a series of years of just literally making mistakes and learning how to present and learning how to pitch and fundraise. And then just realizing I was on the wrong side of the table, which is sort of like, oh, I could be the developer. I can be the architect. Looking at the economic model, it was obvious who you wanted to be to some degree if money was your motivation. And then I was using my architectural skill set to acquire properties because I could advance them for free in my own time. And I could do designs for buildings. I could get them mature and I could beat the market in some ways because another developer has to find an architect to say, what can I do here? Or can I do what I have for this vision? And I could spend all of this money and time. And when I say that, I mean my own time every night, literally my day job, working at night, drawing plans, figuring out the zoning, developing a business plan, and then using fairly sophisticated information to go raise capital with. It was a real market advantage in some ways, but also it took me forever because I was by myself and I didn't have any resources to add other than sweat equity. Over time, the word value became increasingly important to us as a company, where we started with value, AKA green dollar bills, which is, I think, how most real estate folks think about it. and then turned that into like value set, which is like, okay, if we're going to spend $1, and currently we're spending $500 million at a time, you say to yourself, okay, well, if I'm purchasing and our project scale is that big, then we have purchasing power and we get to choose the priorities under which we make those investments. And we can address our mission, which is something that happened over time, which is we transitioned from proving the business model, can an architect be a developer, to having a mission and saying, well, now we need to bump up against some realities about how we make decisions that are non-economic. So we focus on beauty, equity, and sustainability as the three pillars of what we do in order to make decisions. And so it means usually every project's different. Usually we're trying to address these other fundamental needs, knowing that we live in a city that has all of these needs.
So when you say designing for the value or being able to see the value, today, do you see that in terms of the urban landscape in New York City, being able to look at a building, an empty block, and have a vision of how do we bring beauty, equity, and sustainability to this location? Is that the frame now that informs
Yeah,
decisions?
yeah, it kind of works that way. It's funny. We say we're more defined by what we say no to than what we say yes to.
Sure.
It's editing out and being myopically focused on Brooklyn, which is why, we say we're Brooklyn developers and we don't develop in Manhattan anymore because we know our neighborhood. We can see better. All of our employees live and work here, right? For the preponderance of them anyway. And like when you get to know places and we ride our bicycles to our job sites and all of those things, you get to know places so intimately, then you can just see better than your competitive set. And so acquiring things for us or growing our company would be fundamentally easy, which is we just have to agree to pay more than the next idiot for our, for our next acquisition, right? But truthfully, it's about like, how can we beat the market using our skill set? And so we usually figure, okay, we know this place, we know this is happening. We also know these other fundamental factors politically are happening at the same time. And we just did this unique thing that nobody else knows about. And the combination of those things usually creates for value. And so we're usually finding really hard to develop properties, like the worse, the better almost. The harder it is for the rest of the marketplace to see, the better. Oftentimes we're the only bidder for something, or we're like so much more above the balance of the market just because we can see something that we can win it. And usually, if we choose to spend the time on an acquisition, we can beat it unless somebody's just planning ultra luxury, which has no other value proposition, and saying, well, the market says $2,500 a foot, I can do 3,000 a foot, and that's fine. That's not us. We don't win in value in those types of locations, 57th Street corridor or something like that, right? That's in Manhattan. But the equivalent Brooklyn ones, we would never win in because it's not what we're interested in. We're not just interested in making money.
I don't know if you remember, but and I'm trying to think of what the movie was, but there's that very famous Michael Keaton movie line when he's working for a newspaper and he's trying to get some job, and then he's not going to get it because he steals a lead off the desk of the guy who's interviewing him, and they find out, and they're like, "You just lost your chance to cover the world," and he's like, "Oh yeah, well I don't live in the mother loving world. I live in New York City." So thinking about your comment now about Brooklyn, which kind of feels that way. It's sort of like, well, Brooklyn kind of is, many might say it's sort of now culturally, increasingly economically, creatively, certainly a center of the world. So to say you're a Brooklyn designer actually carries a lot more weight than if I am a Westchester County, architect, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Right? So you're in the heart of where people are looking to understand what's new, what's current. I mean, that's just clear.
Brooklyn has gone through an extraordinary transition over the last decade or 20 years. It used to be a market that was for value. No, go to Brooklyn, you can get something cheaper there, or go to Brooklyn, you can get more space there. But at the time when we committed to Brooklyn, we had started in West Chelsea before the High Line was built. Then we went to Hudson Yards before Hudson Yards existed. And then we packed up from the city and we're like, we're moving to Brooklyn because our office was already here and we're never leaving. And we chose to focus there. But what we realized, I think, at that moment was that nobody was designing products or developing products for people who preferred Brooklyn over Manhattan. And because we're right across from Wall Street, there are plenty of nine-figure and incredibly wealthy individuals here and families that were looking for things that were not brownstone Brooklyn and who had the capacity to spend and the spending power. I also think people misunderstand Brooklyn relative to Manhattan, which is in and of itself, Brooklyn's the fourth largest city in the United States, and we're only 10,000 people away from taking over Chicago. The net positive migration to Brooklyn has been fairly extraordinary. And the sort of economic demographics around Brooklyn are incredibly positive. And so it has to be looked at its own place. And it does have its own brand, its own cultural qualities to it. And our company just affiliates with that, which is a younger generation of, call it the second gentrifiers, right? We're the second wave. The people who moved into Brooklyn Heights or have always been there, or who moved into Brooklyn in the 70s and bought in Cobble Hill and Park Slope and all the surrounding influence. That's a generation. We're the new generation. And, the popularity of it and the things that we have here are to some degrees unmatched. We're a series of wonderful neighborhoods. Those neighborhoods vary quite a lot. The retail feels different. We have an amazing waterfront. And over the period of time, there's been enough rezonings and changes in neighborhoods and landmarking and other things that have been incredibly positive influences for just a really wonderful and walkable and livable city. And unsurprisingly, there are areas of Brooklyn, and our history shows we outpace certain neighborhoods in Manhattan by a while, actually, other than the super Tony neighborhoods, right? Like you get to Tribeca and West Chelsea, and I think for the most part we'll always trail, but we're starting to get to a place where rents and condominium prices in the best neighborhoods are turning into London. It's not like one side of the river and the other side of the river, right? It's a city with a circle drawn around it. And we think of lower Manhattan and Northwest Brooklyn in that one single circle. And that philosophy and that thesis has definitely held true economically and is obviously happening culturally.
Yeah, I mean, I can clearly see that. Years ago, 2 decades ago, I lived in Greenpoint. So
Yeah.
maybe I was in between that first and second generation. I don't know. I mean, I was just,
Yeah.
and it was awesome.
Super early for Greenpoint.
Loved it. Moved there in 2005, I want to say. I was in this like ridiculously cool, almost too cool for me, New York City book club. One of my friends just like let me in. I think she felt sorry for me. She was working in film and they were all doing, one guy was like making cheese with Martha Stewart and they're all, like super interesting. And I hosted the book club one night in my apartment in Greenpoint and they all show up and they're like almost sweating, booking for the door, like, we made it. We're in Brooklyn, like it just like, yes, this is crazy, and I'm like, yeah, okay. It's New Yorkers, the Manhattanites, but that's clearly all changed. So part of the reason why I reached out, of course, is the work that you're doing now with the Ally Block, and you've built the first electric skyscraper, and you've just announced the financing for what will be the largest passive house tower, I believe, in the world. This is very exciting. I've heard you talk about it in a couple of different ways. For me, having lived in New York and going back a couple of decades when I was there, I remember the moment when the Bank of America Tower opened in Manhattan. I believe it was a LEED gold, maybe platinum, but at the time, pushing the envelope of what green building might be for a large commercial building. Bank of America as the anchor tenant was interesting. There was just a lot about that was culturally interesting. Fast forward to today, when I think about your project, and so I want to talk about it with you, but when I think about the Ally Block and what you're doing, it strikes me to have that kind of same level of significance, where if I think about the Bank of America Tower in New York City, it seems to me encapsulate what happened in, let's say, like the first quarter of this century, if like really good projects, right? And the Ally Block and what you're now doing in Brooklyn seems to embody this ethos that hopefully is going to move us forward, hopefully much faster now over this next quarter century. I know you talk about building over a 100-year horizon, of course, but it strikes me to have that much cultural significance. I will say that I discovered it, as has probably millions and millions of people, maybe hundreds of millions at this point, but I discovered it in Fast Company when that project put Ally on the 50 most innovative companies in the world. So it's getting clear broadcast, audience way beyond New York City and Brooklyn. But I'm curious how you think about that project. And I'll say one more thing, Jared, before I ask you to respond. When I read about it, the words are historic, monumental, world-changing. And I just wonder, you're in the grind of it with your company and your team, but does it feel that way to you? Maybe that's our in to talk about. And then we're going to talk about what the project is and some of the things that distinguish and define it.
It's an awesome question. It's so funny because none of that passes our mind. Like we're not doing it for those motivations, right? Development is about managing risk fundamentally. And most developers, once they acquire the property and they finance it, they don't want to take any other risk at all, right? And so it's about mitigating that risk and minimizing that. Again, we're on the opposite end of that spectrum, and all of our sustainability, which, 20 years ago was sort of what we called foundational, and we didn't feel like we had to talk about it because we felt just an obligation to address sustainability. But then each project always has its sort of unique challenges. And our early passive house work, when we built one of the first passive houses in the United States, actually in Syracuse, New York, AJ and I were teaching there, and there was a design competition. Rick Cookville won, great, analogous to the Bank of America Tower. And we built these little test houses. Mark Robbins was the dean at Syracuse University. And then we built the first passive houses in Brooklyn. That was sort of born out of this idea, or this actual constraint, which is we're right next to the Manhattan Bridge, and they had to be so dead quiet. And you had to address, vibration and sound intrusion in such a way that you almost had to build passive house in order for even to be habitable. And then just taking these sort of standards forward with us about, okay, high performance equals building a great building envelope. Okay, not that complicated. Addressing thermal bridging, smaller mechanical systems, all benefits. And so it's kind of just matured into this funny way of thinking about development risk. And at the Alloy Block, specifically, this electrification, and we were really focused on decarbonization, actually came out of a very practical risk, which was our governor was fighting with National Grid over the expansion of the pipeline. And there was a very real risk that we actually couldn't even get gas at the building because we didn't understand the politics of it. And National Grid was saying they were out of capacity. And our governor was saying, I'm not going to let you expand the pipeline. And so we just went to our engineers. We're like, well, what does that mean? So it was a very funny, actually, can you do this? And they were like, well, the first step is you have to build a high performance building envelope. And that was already part of our repertoire of non-negotiables. And we're like, okay, that's easy. And then it was like, well, the hardest thing to do for electrification is hot water production. And the technology was sort of emerging for electric boilers of scale at that time internationally. And so that was a risk. But then the other one was a perceived marketing risk, which is just will residents accept induction versus gas cooking? Because gas has been sold to us over the years. I have to have my Viking stove, or I have to have whatever, and that equals luxury, right? And would people perceive that? But those are really the only three things that you have to tackle at the moment. We were like, well, this is kind of stupid. We're going to build a high performance building envelope. The triple glazing costs literally over the entirety of the project is literally nothing. It's a couple dollars a square foot over the facade area. At this point, it's like $3 a square foot or $5 a square foot or something fairly de minimis. We're eliminating systems that are really hard to get approved, like gas. So for us, it was like, wow, we don't have to deal with the fire department and National Grid and getting the gas turned on, and we won't have to build an entire system. And we can locate our boilers and our other things in the least valuable space and not have to put flues all the way up through the entire of the building, or put it on the roof, or come up with something else. All that makes sense. And so we were really taking a bet on the cost of running the electric boilers, doing hot water storage in off-peak times, and coming up with a couple of other features in order to mitigate some of the, call it, risk exposure. But gas pricing, we know as a commodity, is much more volatile than electric production and delivery of electric production, but for the fact that our grid in New York is really old. And so we thought it was actually a better bet over the long term, knowing that New York City's grid is dirty, but that over time our building would get cleaner as the grid got cleaner. And so making this 100-year investment, as we were talking about before, it's sort of like, what am I investing in? Why would I invest in gas, even though today it's cleaner? When 30 years from now, someone's going to have a carbon tax, they don't know what that is. Why would I introduce that volatility as part of my investment thesis? And then, of course, we also have the world around us, which is a cultural movement. AJ and I have kids, and they're in their teenage years, and it's one of these fundamental things of coming home where my kids were teenagers and they're literally leaving school to go march with Greta Thunberg downtown in Manhattan. And, I have to come to the dinner table and be like, well, what did you do today? So it's sort of like, well, actually, we just made the first carbon neutral building in New York City, and we were able to acquire all of our energy from solar sources through community solar. And we're making the first carbon neutral building, and that sense of responsibility to their generation. And also the sort of where people are spending their money personally. Okay, they can buy firsthand Patagonia, but they prefer buying worn wear from Patagonia because it's secondhand and has a lower carbon footprint. So could that be a story? Electrification of vehicles is obvious. And our first marketing for the building had signs on it that said 440 electric cars, and we crossed out the word cars and wrote homes. How do you convey that information to the marketplace? Where do people choose to spend? Would it be perceived as a luxury? Would we have more stickiness because somebody moved into a carbon neutral home? And could we make an argument about it? And we're starting to prove that actually there is what some people are calling a greenium around sustainability for homes. It's the biggest difference that someone can make to their carbon footprint, just if anybody's measuring. But some people also don't care and just want the design thing. And they're like, oh, I want the nicest one. And so we win there, or we win because we're across the street from the best transportation in Brooklyn, or we win because we had literally had a couple of people who were like, I wanted induction cooking. Like, and I couldn't find it anywhere else in the marketplace. So it's so funny. We won't know for a few years whether our business thesis was right, but it didn't really cost us any more. The power of it was in making the decision in and of itself and committing to that and actually getting it done when nobody else was doing it. And a lot of our industry peers were like, why are you doing it? But it has paid off in extraordinary ways, whether you just get to sleep better at night because you know you did the right thing, or because we helped use our lobbying and our PR teams to help create legislation to create a gas ban in the first place in New York City and at the state, which we did, just by enabling people to stand there and say, see, it is possible. Like the possibility of it happening and actually getting to the achievement is the difficult part. But technologically, it's kind of really dumb. And even going to the world's tallest passive house, which I find very funny, the differences between 505 state and 1/3 is that at 505 state, we couldn't really focus on our EUI or energy intensity usage. We just couldn't because the electric boilers are such a penalty. And the building's a triangle. So the building envelope area to floor area is just really punitive. But we weren't focused on that because we also knew we were going to find a carbon neutral source for the energy. So we were like, well, if we're carbon neutral, what's the difference if it's inefficient to some degree? And we can accept that inefficiency because if we find solar as a source or wind or whatever clean source, it was like, okay, if it's clean, does it matter how efficient it is? And on the second phase, we have a square site or we have a site that we can build efficiently on. We can use the same building envelope performance. There's new technology for hot water production, which is in the form of air source heat pumps. So we can cut our energy usage down dramatically. And the only significant difference is, using ERV systems to bring in or ventilation systems to bring in fresh air and use the latent heat from the exhaust air to preheat the incoming air so it can efficiently bring in fresh air into the building, which is inherently sealed. Passive house buildings are, you can look at it like a sheep, like you're really just building a super insulated building envelope, but that means it has to be airtight as well. So whatever analogy you want to use, igloo cooler, sheep, whatever, you're trying to maintain the temperature like you do a refrigerator. Keep the door closed. It can keep that temperature fairly efficiently. Passive house is the same thing. Keep the windows and doors closed, provide fresh air through alternative means that's very efficient. And you don't need to open the window because there's always fresh air in your apartment and you're just delivering fresh air in a unique way versus the traditional way. It doesn't mean our windows don't open. Of course they do, but people don't find the need in the experience for that.
So I appreciate you.
Sorry, that was a long answer.
No, it was perfect. I asked the question, right? What I'm hearing is we'd already been doing some of this because we've built passive house. We built that way up in Syracuse. We built that way in Dumbo. We had to do it in Dumbo just to make the buildings habitable, triple glazed windows, and you start to learn. And then you start to say, okay, well, look, we've got this block. It's in downtown Brooklyn. We're going to build on it. We have a vision for what we want to build. And there's some risk around natural gas, some accessibility. There's local law 97 coming. I know that probably a factor. We know that the policies are going to shift and there's going to be more of a stick tied to if you have certain carbon emissions coming out of your building or whatever that calculation is. But what I'm really hearing is a very practical point of view of like, if the technology is there in the first building, it sounds like it felt like it was at least pretty darn close at 505 State Street. And we know how to do this. Maybe it's actually less risk to do it than to not do it, provided that the tenants will accept things like induction and that the costs aren't crazy for some of this technology around electric, water heating, et cetera, et cetera. But all of that all sounds, the way you talk about it, Jared, which also has struck me, and I heard you talk about this on a prior podcast, is like, it's very practical and none of it really comes across as like, let's go change the world. You got to come home and have a conversation with your kids. I get that as well. But there's something about that I just find so delightful and a pattern that I've seen as we've talked with leaders across industries. Yes, of course, you find certain people who are animated by, from the get-go from climate. And then you find people who are, like we had on this guy, Al Sabloui, who runs a company called Butterfly. I don't know if you've come across him. They do energy as a service for like McDonald's and Popeyes and KFC. That dude's not motivated initially
by climate. I mean, he is now, as his eyes have opened and he sees what he can do, as he can help these restaurants, high energy intensive restaurants, upgrade, cut their carbon, cut their costs, cut their energy. But he didn't start out from saying, he's like, this is just a really good idea. This just makes a ton of business sense. And that, to me, as someone who's thinking about how do you drive the world to scale adoption, is way more powerful that there's a solid business case around it.
The rhetoric around it discredits the opportunity in my mind as a business model, which is it has to be born out of a personal interest to do it. And my personal reasons and our office's personal reasons and motivations are just to do the right thing. With real estate, in my role, certainly, I always have to be selling something. I'm raising capital, we're talking publicly, but making promises in the industry and like living with ourselves about what we're making and the fact that we live in cities and in places that are important. And as my business partner AJ likes to say, we don't make cupcakes. We can't throw them out if we make a bad batch, right? We have to make something that can stand the test of time. And I think you have to genuinely care about the thing that you're doing without whatever the balance of the outcomes are. Like, it's fun to change the industry and to create policy. It's fun to prove that it can be done. It's fun to speculate on a future that we believe is better than the one that we're in today. But it is very personal, and it's not that we don't have an ego. Of course we do. We're in the business. We're making a 730-foot tall building. So that would be naive to say that we don't. But it's a much more personal journey for us. And it's much more about changing the industry, I think, little by little, rather than rattling everybody's cage and making it unbelievable. Because, I don't know, we live in a world that's so polarized today about communication that's right and what's wrong and what the truth is and all those things, that we find this sort of consistency of our approach of building on each of our experiences, trying to get to what the truth is, measuring our results, sharing back that we might have made a mistake where that's something that we tried didn't work. And, now the sustainability is to some degree table stakes. To your point, Local Law 97 is driving people to a more sustainable place, which is great in New York City. We have a lot more developers asking us how we did it, and we're always willing to share. It's why I love coming on podcasts like this to talk about it and to be sincere and honest about what our experiences are. And now we're starting to focus on the equity part of what our business is about. And that's the hardest pillar to address. Beauty, we can say we're all architects as developers. Okay, we're going to provide as much thought and design the best product, but that's completely subjective. Sustainability can now be measured. We can make these choices. And, we built these passive house schools on our block. We're the second LEED Gold community in the United States. And we did that because we made promises to the community when we asked for a change in density. We said we're going to build the most sustainable block in Brooklyn, and we ourselves want to meet and beat those promises. And we did. We exceeded every promise that we made on the sustainability side. But the fact of the matter is that people live in buildings, and there is inherent inequities in the real estate market in New York, and specifically in Brooklyn or any major city these days, where people are rent burdened. And aside from that, people aren't getting the same opportunities. And so building affordability into our projects, the first phase was 43% minority and women-owned businesses that did the construction. Our second phase is just approaching 40%. We do job training. All of the units are identical, whether they're affordable or market rate. The affordable units get full access to all of the amenities. There's just nothing different. And our role and our goal is to make sure that not having money isn't a stigma. Like when you walk into the lobby and you were a formerly homeless person, but you now literally won the lottery. We had 107,000 applications for 44 apartments. If you were lucky enough to win that lottery, when you come home, you should feel great. And what does that mean? It means we don't have fancy finishes all over the place. We're literally using like raw concrete and simple wood, but we're not using marble and leather and all of those other things. We feel like the design can democratize how it feels to come home, and that you should have full access and everything should be identical, and that there should be no stigma to having an affordable unit. So the fact that they have the same appliances, the same finishes, the same tile, the same everything, and that if they're working from home, they go down to the amenity space too and use the workspace or go use the gym and have a better life and be healthy and all those things. Those things we're starting to really focus on, like that perspective of equity, which the duality of the word equity in real estate is, or in probably any entrepreneurial business, right? Equity traditionally means green dollar bills, right? Like, oh, I raised equity today. That doesn't mean that I made it more fair for human beings. It means it means I raised money, right? And so trying to tackle that issue sort of heads on, which is personal but also requires a degree of like specific engagement and intent in wanting to make it a more equitable place.
Yeah, that just has a lot of resonance with me. I really appreciate that perspective. As we started this conversation talking about your firm is the architect and the developer, that gives you a lot more agency, autonomy to be able to do these things that feel sort of like an operating playbook. It sounds like for Alloy, but from the outside is like, oh my gosh, this is amazing. This company is really pushing this industry forward and showing what's possible, as we've just talked about. But you don't 100% finance your own projects. You still have backers and investors. And so I'm just curious to understand, as you talk about these dynamics and you talk about bringing equity, just like you described, which is so beautiful, into how you develop, what is that conversation like with your investors? I know you put a lot of capital into these projects as well, but I'd love to just understand that dynamic more about the hundreds of millions of dollars that line up behind Alloy to finance these projects.
I'll rewind a little bit to the beginning of the commentary. So we're actually 5 companies. We're a development company, we're an architecture company, we have a brokerage company, we have a construction company, and we have a management company. And that sort of full circle approach to our work means that in every decision that we make, we try to continue to influence the outcome and get it to align into our mission. We don't do all of the affiliated services, but we often do them in collaboration with someone else. And so while we're not the construction team, we have on-site construction people that are there full time. And while we're not the sole broker, we work with a team and an outside brokerage company. And so we're always negotiating with our lenders, partners, equity partners about what affiliated services that Alloy can do, because in some degree, we've eviscerated the traditional set of checks and balances that the AIA has established for an architect, where we literally sign a change order as architect, as owner, and as contractor. Yeah. And we've made all of the decisions and there's nobody to check on us, right? So the way that we've gotten past that and gotten to the agency over time has been through 20 years of great performance. We have an extraordinary return history through good times and bad. And that gives you a lot of freedom when it comes to raising capital. To get to the real question at hand is, we literally try to do one project at a time. And what that means is we can have one project doing architecture at a time, one project in construction at a time, right? So we kind of stack up projects behind them, but it means that the principals can be focused on where the risk is and participate in all of the daily decisions. And whether it's a marketing conversation or a conversation about language or a construction issue or a political issue or a capital issue, we're always there. And that focus on the principals who are the guarantors on the loan, that matters to people. And people really appreciate the granularity of our business model and that editing of our work, which is we can only really do one project at a time. And so if you look at our trajectory, each project has been successively bigger than the next, because we realize, with this team, we can do more at once. And so now we're spending $500 million at a time, which is, funny to me. I've never been more in debt in my life, but it's fun. But it means that capital follows that success, right? 20 years of high teens returns, that matters. And like the rest of the world, capital is also seeking opportunities, and they have sided one way or the other, which is, I don't care, your project's great, it returns well, great. Or I do care, and I'm editing where my capital goes. And if I'm going to invest capital and I have a social agenda, I want to invest it with you as a fiduciary of that capital. I would say that one of the ways that we control these outcomes for our projects is we do try to exclusively use our own capital for all of the pre-development work. So we acquire a property, we design everything, we get it shovel ready, we get to permits, and we close, and then our investors come in. And so we go out to the marketplace saying, this is what the project is, this is what it returns like, and these are the outcomes that we are anticipating. Some of those are economic and a lot of those are mission. And they get to choose. I'm in it just because for the cash, and I'm in it because the cash and because of the social value set. And so we don't want to negotiate those values. And so we're presenting openly, and I think post-COVID, we have been able to really do that in a very meaningful way, is transition the way we talk about our work from being solely economic and solely the nicest to having these alternative outcomes where people were worried about the future health of the city. They were worried about health and safety. They were focused on sustainability issues, right? We had a fairly significant shift. And I remember when we got 505 State approved, Goldman, who was our lender, Goldman Sachs was our lender, he said, this is the first time credit committee had a sincere conversation about sustainability and social equity as a criteria for how they would go about approving projects, which was really wonderful for us to hear. And then we have seen repeatedly on the value side, especially now that 505 is finished and we finished on time, on budget through COVID with global crises around us, we created extraordinary demand in the capital marketplace for people who wanted to finance the first all electric skyscraper, the first carbon neutral building in New York City. We had 14 different lenders competing for that business, and we got incredible terms, and we leased up incredibly quickly. Now, it might be because of the newness, it might be because of the enthusiasm about Brooklyn, it might be because of the sustainability, it might be a moment in time where capital was starting to become very liquid in the marketplace. However we look at it, we created meaningful demand, I think, at that moment because of our story, because of our value set, and closing on capital, $535 million worth of capital for phase two was like, we just finished on time, on budget. Here are the returns for that. We're going to do that right next door. And by the way, it's going to be more sustainable. We attracted more interested capital. And to this day, now there are private investors who are typically out seeking some GP investors who have been approaching us and saying, hey, I missed the last one. When are you going to ask again? And so success begets success in the capital markets. And I think there are a lot of family offices, there are a lot of hedge funds, there are a lot of banks who are saying, no, you guys are best in class. This is what we're looking to do with capital. There is no liability if we make the most sustainable building in the world. And your track record says you can finish on time, on budget. That is a good investment, right? Until our administration changes the banking system to say, no, you can't, like the equivalent of the DEI work that's happening, to say, no, banks can't lend based on sustainability or social equity. And we're happy to be at the tip of the spear on that and try to push the envelope, open the communication. It has definitely worked for us. But to some degree, while we may make the ultimate choice based on who our best partner is, and that is absolutely what we did for 130 Avenue, we found the best partner in Vistria that we could, socially focused capital that cares about mission, that cares about where their money is being put to work and making affordability and sustainability and recognizing that they work in cities was a real privilege. And that's a choice we get to make when we're leveling sheets. It's like, okay, these dollars are the same, but which ones, I don't want to ever negotiate value set. My partners and I want to find partners that want to push us into the more sustainable decision or the more socially just decision. And so for us, that's a quality of life issue because partners are hard and, we don't make cupcakes. Our partnership will be 10 years with somebody and with capital. And so knowing that we're starting from the same playing field and it's not just about money where someone can say, why would you invest in that? Because we make a lot of those decisions. Why would we choose to invest more in this thing? And that's the hard part about development is trying to see the future and what people care about and where value comes. And sometimes that's design, sometimes that's an extra couple percent on a better HVAC system and a facade system. And hopefully our job is to edit all that down so that you can't tell where we invested the money. You just know that it's the nicest thing and it also happens to achieve these other goals.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. As I've been listening to you and as we've been having this conversation, the question that's rattling around in my mind is you've talked about being excited with 505 State Street, the all-electric skyscraper. Like having that exist, having that be a representation of showing this can be done. Others could learn from this too. And you've said you're happy to talk to other firms and developers and whoever who wants to know how you got that done. Okay, so a lot of that may be around, well, how did you get to all electric? What's the technology? What's the kind of building playbook there? That can be replicated. But when I hear you talk about your internal development model, the partners in the firm are always in a position to be able to focus on the area of the business where there's most risk or the area of a project where there's most risk. That's not necessarily as replicable in other firms. I mean, that's really interesting to me. And you talked about how that also instills confidence in investors, which I completely get as a founder. And then, you've talked about your 2 decades of having a great history of returns and the confidence that goes along with that. So as I hear this package coming together, some of it sounds like, yes, another firm might be able to look at Alloy Development and be like, they really de-risked some things here. They showed that this can be done. Okay, let's go push. Some of the things sound like kind of a competitive advantage that you guys have to keep doing your projects that maybe aren't quite as easy for folks to follow. With that said, what you've also said is like you're hopefully opening up a broader conversation about where capital might flow into other more sustainably focused projects. I guess what I'm saying is there's some nuance there. I'm just curious to get your take.
There are obvious things that are replicable. I think our business model is harder to replicate. The principals and our team members, as an example, my two partners and I have had a call every single day, every single business day for 20 years together at 8:30 in the morning every day. And it's kind of an inviolable meeting that everybody knows. It's something either bad has to happen or something personal has to be in the way. But if we miss it at 8:30, we make it up at another time. And even when, like, I was in the Philippines with my family over the break, I was calling it at 8:30 at night. Like, it's such an important phone call because to make these difficult decisions, you need to know each other incredibly well personally. You need to sense when somebody's feeling uncomfortable. You need to be able to debate without feeling like you can't speak your mind. And when you're investing as much capital as we are, and turns out we now own 505 without any partners, we've invested so much capital there that being so closely connected and that culture of connectedness is the hardest thing to replicate. We celebrated our 20-year anniversary. We took our whole office and all of our employees and all of their significant others and their children to Berlin. And the sort of closeness of our group means that we intimately get to know each other in a lot of ways. And we are deliberately small. Like, I would rather in the future, and we talk about this, like, well, it'd be very easy to grow Alloy. As I said before, we could just buy more properties and create another team that's doing the same thing. But the three principals can only consume so much guarantee risk at one time. We're borrowing an extraordinary clip at the moment. And you have to be able to sleep at night and you find these personal tolerances. But we'd rather do nothing if it's not the right project. And I think that's an unusual bit of context to say, hey, we love doing business together. We would throw ourselves in front of a bus for each other every day of the week, plus our team members, like, we really care. But we're also willing to, like, stop if it's not exactly the right opportunity. We don't want to be a machine that has to feed the machine itself. We want to be a machine that's doing it because we want to. And I think that's what's made our business really successful. And our partner, Catherine, has really given us that freedom. She's, proven to be just an incredibly resilient chair of the company and capable. And in the really tough times when there's hard decisions, she's the most intrepid person you've ever met and really capable, and also really great at editing to say, what you're saying is this, what I'm hearing is this, and we should not do that. Because you get caught up in the moment, especially in the world that we're in today. The news cycle is so crazy and everything's so volatile that consistency and the ability to together make really level decisions that are not about growth, that are not about some other fantasy, but just about enjoying the work together is what has made the culture of Alloy, which is why it's not eponymously named, right? Alloy in and of itself, the name in and of itself implies a sort of connectedness of disparate things to make something better. And we have tried to embed that in our culture in a really meaningful way and in everything that we do. And we didn't know that at the time, and it wasn't so deliberate, although it was about different people coming together. But it's really starting to mean more, as we get older and we're sort of living with that culture. And it's really wonderful. So I don't know if that answered your question, but
It did.
there are parts that are replicable and parts that are not.
It's a fantastic answer. Thank you. And just really wonderful to hear about that culture. I just want to thank you for taking time to really go deep with me and for our audience on the podcast. This was a wonderful conversation and I learned a lot, really a lot. I'm very excited about the work that you do and I'm very excited to continue to follow it. So appreciate you being here with us today.
Thank you so much. These are always great therapy sessions for me to communicate the personal feelings that I'm having at any moment.
Excellent. Well, we are the beneficiaries, so I appreciate that.
Thanks so much for listening to my conversation with Jared. If you enjoyed it and appreciate the perspective Supercool brings to the business and climate conversation, please take a moment to subscribe and leave a review. It's the best way you can help us reach new audiences who would benefit from these conversations too. See you next time.